Okay, hello, thank you. I'm Brian Evans from the University of Alabama. I'll do a quick warning. I have this habit. I don't travel well, so when I fly, I take Valium. It's prescribed. I love it. I recommend it highly. Unfortunately, while I was flying up from Alabama yesterday, I decided in a very nice, relaxed state to completely redo this presentation. And I got up this morning and I'm going through the slides and I'm going, what was I thinking? So I will do my best to try to make this make sense, because clearly it made sense to me yesterday. I'm not quite sure now. But this is the key to me. Often when I teach, I talk about sort of the binary nature of things. And this deception that it's either or. But this does sort of lay out, for those of us that work in visual music, and I'm a visual music artist, and I put it mostly under the heading of abstract animation. I create abstract animation and sound scores. So that's sort of the niche of this, what we're learning to be this very large world that we call visual music. But this has been sort of the standard mantra, certainly through the 20th century, of visual music artists, that goes all the way back to Kandinsky. The laws of harmony are the same for painting and music, whatever those laws are. And Kandinsky wrote this in his Concerning the Spiritual in Art. He attributed it to a composer named Henri Ravel. I'm assuming he meant Maurice Ravel. But he was saying, my composer friend, he references the article, but I can't find the article. It's in some very obscure journal that doesn't seem to exist anymore. But this is really it, this idea of visual music, of connecting. But Michel Chion, whose writings I think, even he's talking about sound and cinema, really articulates what, at least to my leaning, is perhaps more true. There is no natural and pre-existing harmony between sound and image. Hence, this becomes sort of part of our challenge if we're working as artists in visual music. So I have a music background. I'm trained as a music conservatory, 10 years in the conservatory. And this was our mantra. Stravinsky sort of articulated well the composer's worldview. Music means nothing outside itself. And it really became the mantra for Kandinsky and so many of these artists in early modernism, the idea of art for art's sake. I create this thing, I put it on the wall, and that's it. You just plug into this. And we call that formalism with a capital F. This idea that we have connected to this significant truth. I put it on the wall, you will see it, and you will have this experience that Clive Bell or Roger Fry would call aesthetic ecstasy. And the engagement is complete. But this has been what composers have always thought of, and indeed it's been the luxury we have. I write a piano sonata or a string quartet. I don't have to tell you what it means. Right? It's a string quartet. Listen to it and enjoy it, and it means what it means. It's what it is. It's a string quartet, and we find meaning. This is the thing that Kandinsky was saying. He said, people can find meaning in a string quartet or a fugue. Why can't they find meaning in my painting, even if it doesn't look like something you recognize? And the whole essence of musical instruments as we created them was to make sounds that didn't refer to something in the world. So that when you listen to a piano, you don't go, oh, well, that doesn't sound like a landscape. The whole idea is that the sounds were freed from having to represent. And that's what Kandinsky was saying he wanted to do. So musique concrète becomes this interesting thing because all of a sudden we have the ability to represent sounds that do represent, where in the past we hadn't. But these are the issues, the problems, the goals of formalism. Music of the spheres, the idea that you're connecting to some Platonic truth, some Pythagorean truth, universal truth, this idea of the grand narrative, the modernist worldview, and again, this idea of it's an instrumental piece. It doesn't have to mean anything. It's a piano work. And visual music composers were very much into this sort of frame. So this becomes our problem because this is modernism. Someone has infused somehow these grand truths in the air, and I am the great artist. I'm special. I can receive that signal, and I'm able to then create these objects to send that signal out, and you appreciate it. And because of that, I can create a painting, and someone will pay $100 million for it. This is why we pay what we pay for these objects that we make that we call art, because they're supposed to be infused with some kind of grand truth. Now, these sort of ideas, although they still hold sway with many, post-World War II, they started to unravel a little bit. And we as visual artists and as visual music composers have to find our place in that thread between Kandinsky's idea and Michel Chion's idea in our search for meaning. So this is sort of, again, my worldview. Visual music, as it has been practiced, is really a subset of experimental film, at least up until the past decade or two before interactivity has slipped into the world, which all falls under the rubric of cinema. And as Manovich himself says, the language of new media is the language of cinema. So cinematic language has to be much of something that we bring into this. And what's interesting now is I'm starting to believe that cinematic language is going to be subsumed by social media. But that becomes a whole other conversation. So if we're dealing with sound, specifically in a cinematic space, we have first and foremost what Chion calls diegetic sound. And that's the things you're watching on the film that are making sound. A car crashes, you hear the sound of a car crash. Someone shoots a gun, you hear a gun go off. Someone's mouth is moving, you hear them speaking. This is logical for us. The sound that we're seeing on the screen is the sound we're hearing is consistent with what we're seeing on the screen. Now, the problem with visual music, and especially abstract animation, is nothing you're seeing on the screen makes sounds. So the sounds are totally irrelevant to the experience in terms of traditional cinematic activity. The sounds are not makers of sound, so we have to, as artists working in a visual music world, figure out what is this relationship between what we're seeing and what we're hearing, because what we're seeing has no relationship to the world in terms of sound making. Now, in cinematic sound, there are actually multiple layers in an audio space in cinema that all have to be dealt with. The dialogue first and foremost in most of your traditional film. Then the sound design, which has now become its own discipline out there in the academic world. All of a sudden, everybody is very conscious of the fact that all those things that are making sound those sounds have to be juicy, and they have to be in 7/1 surround, and they have to do all these really nice things. But then there's the non-diegetic, which is now also very much a part of the cinematic space. And first and foremost is music. Music has always been there in the cinema space, a sort of commentary on what's going on, or to give you a layer of what's going on. You have a happy person swimming, and all of a sudden you hear boom, 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 right? So the music is very, very powerful in terms of controlling you within this cinematic space. And then narration, if you have a narrator, which again is a sound that's not necessarily connected to the film. So we, of course, in the visual music space, are going to be dealing primarily with music, although music in very loose terms, because certainly in post-World War II musical traditions, the set of sounds that we'll call music has expanded dramatically from instrumental music to musique concrète to just about anything now. So I've laid out these three categories, which just helped me in trying to figure out my relationships, and I realized after watching the concert this afternoon, of course I left off the one that is the most typical in the cinematic world, which is music added to a pre-created piece. And so we saw Jules Engel's work, for example, who was basically treating his pieces as real cinema. He says, I'm going to compose my cinematic work, and then I'm going to go get a composer to score it, which also is how they did cartoons for years. Or actually, they did the reverse. You get the music, and then they could easily line up to it. Image choreography is perhaps the most common, because often animators were not confident with the temporal structure, so they'd say, I'm going to do a silly symphony or a melody. I'm going to get myself a nice piece of music, and I'm going to animate to it. And I'll show a quick example of that, a very, very short excerpt from yet another of Fissinger's studies, because he did it so well. And actually, for some reason, this machine of mine, don't ever use brand new technology when you have to give a presentation. It's not even showing up. Let's see if this will happen. So Fissinger, in his study number 7, took a Brahms Rhapsody and choreographed to it. So that just gives you a good quick example. But it's clear and fairly common, and even today, Dennis Miller, a good friend of mine who's a really powerful practitioner of visual music today, we'll see some of his work tonight. He's a composer by training. He composes pieces with all the tools he can bring to temporal structure as a composer, and then he animates to that. It's a very powerful way to approach these things. So another way to go is what I call, sort of image sound composition, where they're composed together, whether as a group or as one individual. And I'm just giving us a little quick. I'm touching some of the great guys here, just because this has been all these practitioners have all done this to some degree or another. The Whitney brothers are an interesting group, interesting pair, because they were really charting lots of interesting territory back in the late 30s, early 40s. And one of them was in actually creating these pieces where the image and the music are composed together to create this sort of larger sort of vision. One of the other things they were doing was probably some of the very first generative art that was coming out of our technologies in the 1900s. And here you see them with their fancy machines made out of old World War II machinery or World War I machinery, where they were literally drawing pictures on the optical track with their machines. They would write little programs that would draw wave shapes on the optical track to actually create the sonic part of the work that they were creating. So here's an excerpt from their 5 film exercises where they start with this overarching structure, and they actually then will draw with their little computer analog systems the optical track, while they then would record it. And they're not animations. What they would actually do for the visuals is they would take a film camera and then they'd move little geometric cutouts and things in front of it to create these sort of abstract images, to create this sort of overarching image sound composition. It will play. This is what's been driving me crazy, is that my machine forgets that I've made these links. Let me see if I can find it quick. Just silence. And what I also love about this is it predates electronic music synthesis by a decade. It will play. See, you buy the new Mac and it doesn't work. My little 7
What is the counter, the negative?
I can say, let's try this one. All right, maybe this will do it. It sounds like a lot of what was coming out of German electronic music studios in the 1950s. So perhaps nothing that's Pulitzer Prize winning worthy, but really quite amazing in terms of the pioneering work that they're charting here. I mean, they're literally creating these synthetic sounds through generative techniques that weren't going to really happen again for another 4 decades when composers started using computers. Also the sort of the synthetic sounds that other artists were working with as well. And of course, then this idea, and this is one thing that's become very, very big, I think, in contemporary practice, the idea of working from a point of abstraction and manifesting that into both sound and image, so that both image and sound are data maps of some kind of an abstraction. Bissinger, I'm just pointing to here, is also an early practitioner, and I believe the Center for Visual Music is going to eventually, I think they actually have some of his old sound ornament works, where he would create these graphics, which he would then, with an optical printer, put onto the optical track of the film so that we could actually hear these wave shapes. And then, of course, the real master of this was Norman McLaren, who was literally, I mean, he's right here, he's drawing the sound onto the film here. I mean, literally with his pen, he's drawing the wave shapes onto the sound. There's a great video on the Masters collection where he shows him there with his moviola, and he's going, how does that sound? Ooh, that's nice. Ooh, I mean, it's really quite astounding. And he, like the Whitney brothers, started to chart lots of these sort of new directions. One of the things he did is he would come up with these conceptions, and then he would take the sound, and he would create the sound, and then he would also manifest the sound as the image. So, and he, I think, can be credited as being the first artist to actually have sound and image, you're hearing and seeing the same thing. And I think someone mentioned the piece earlier this morning, Synchrony, that he did in roughly 1971. And here's an excerpt. I hope. Well, let me just test this stuff. So this is just a little taste. He's done a lot of these experiments. He was even doing them back in the 40s, where because he's drawn the sound. But of course, then why can't you just draw those same pictures of the visual part of the space, and you have this high degree of synchronicity. So these become conveniences for us as practitioners in terms of how we can approach thinking about how we're dealing with sound and image as we're trying to combine them together to create some kind of an expression. Data mapping, I've come to believe, is the path into anything. And actually, a whole other talk to be given some time is all we do is data mapping. So why not bring it into our creative practice? Here's a piece I did. Actually, this was a study a long, long time ago. It's a little fractal animation that I then used to generate a sound score. So as this animation unfolds, you've got 4 points on the animation, and just imagine that I put a little microphone on those 4 points so I can hear what those 4 little trees are doing as we see the forest unfold. So I'm actually trying to find a technique where I can take the visual space and add a sonic space to it that actually is telling me information about the visual space, but I've got a forest and a tree kind of relationship. And the key here is to understand how much artistic control I have. I guess I'm still on. And how questionable this whole idea of data mapping comes. I was working in a scientific institution at the time, and it was amazing how much everyone thought I was doing science. But I'm going to do this very quickly here. So I've got 4 voices, those 4 little points that we're tracking on the image. I've mapped them into a variety of domains, the different dimensions that I use to actually, any composer uses to control sound. So I've decided I'm going to be in a quarter tone pitch space, 4 octaves, 24 pitches per octave. Each voice is going to be sampling that time at a different time space, so 5, 6, 7, and 8 samples per some unit of time. So it's going to be very aperiodic, and it's going to sound a whole lot like, for those of you who know, I believe it sounds a whole lot like an octave. we're now hearing and seeing the same process unfold. With the goal of perhaps each sort of informing the other. Now, yes, 5 minutes, so much. So I have a lot of control over these processes, so what if I decide instead I'm only going to let the fractals play the black notes of the piano? And they're all going to play the exact same tempo, the exact same pitch space. It's the exact same data, coming from the exact same place. I'm going to start selling it to New Age. I've found this fractal vision, and I've got my antlers on.
That's Valium.
Huh?
That's Valium.
Okay, so I'm the artist. I have a lot of degrees of freedom within how I choose to constrain these mappings, but they completely change how we receive this content, even though it's the same information. So I just point this out. This is a great reference. The Vadimekum of Digital Art was a group of things for folks to consider if you're having to do critiques of visual art. What are some things you need to consider? And one of them is this idea of, if the project consists in a mere mapping, which my projects do, don't forget that every digital coding is arbitrary. Yeah, that's the bottom line. Every digital coding is arbitrary. Mapping is thus a mere found object. Wonder if the artist brings a shape or meaning. So this comes back down to, where's the meaning? Right? And I still come back to the question, where's the meaning in a Bach cube? Right? Because it's not in the nose. I'll remind you again of Stravinsky, who says that the meaning is there in the nose. Mapping for mapping's sake. And I've talked with a lot of computer music composers who get very angry when I'll ask them a question like, well, what's the context within which you're putting that work? Context? Why do I talk about context? It's my piece. It's my map for map's sake. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of artists that work that way, and there are a lot of people that still agree with that. But again, it's a modernist sort of worldview. And we have another composer who has a very different idea. Music means nothing in itself. And this is where we have to start to consider things. And what neuroscience is teaching us, and we've had a couple of speakers already that point this out, because there is a magic word here. Knowledge is built on prior knowledge. This is a fact. This isn't some philosophical thing. Knowledge is built on prior knowledge. We create from what we already know. There isn't this secret information out there that the lucky ones are able to hone in on. Anything you learn has to be built on connections you already have in your brain. And the process for that is what's called conceptual metaphor. And this is something that cognitive linguistics has figured out and is finding more and more legs in a variety of paths through neuroscience. Maps are metaphors. So here's a wonderful metaphor. Finding equivalences. We can code it up in a digital space. We can convert those numbers to colors when we have pictures. But this is not a fractal. Nowhere near a fractal. Has nowhere near the properties of a fractal. But it's a map of a fractal, and we can learn from it. We can make conceptual decisions about it and develop knowledge. Here's a two-dimensional image that somehow turns into a three-dimensional temporal object. But it's nothing more than ratios of frequencies and phase. I can code it. I can make it a discrete image. And I can turn it into an image. It doesn't really matter. I've got to move very quickly here. Xenakis, for composers, Xenakis was doing this half a century ago. He creates numeric models. Here he was mapping them into live performance because he didn't have computer. It would have been a nightmare to code this up in an electronic music studio. Now he does it all, was able to do it with a UPIC system. He could do it all artificially. We have these visual ways we can map sound in time called sonographs. And we have software that can take this sonograph and can actually synthesize it back into sound. Right? Once we have this ability to take this sonograph, which is a description, a mathematical reduction and abstraction of this sound in time, and there's software, I use a little program called Medicine, it's like $300, that can take this image and can analyze it back into its original sound. Well, of course, Medicine doesn't really care what the image is. I can just as easily put Monet's water lilies into Medicine and turn it into a sound. It's all about the mapping. and I can bring some kind of content to the mapping. And this is where the artistry comes in. And because I can take this image and construct this map out of it, it becomes a fairly simple process to find ways to connect the two. I do time slices, which is like a split scan of an animation. So if I take one of my little animations, I can just track the center scan line, and from that I can actually do what would be equivalent to a split scan photograph of the animation. The result is I now have a still image. That is a map of the temporal unfolding of my animation. I can then turn that image into sound. And I've run out of time to actually play it all. But by having each one of these images, which, sometimes when my composer friends ask me what's my primary software tool that I use to create my pieces, my answer is always Photoshop. It drives them nuts. So once you get multiple, there's just not time to play all this, but I do have not this piece but another piece on concert tomorrow, and all my pieces are done this way. I create these abstract constructions from the original source material using this process of data mapping. So what you end up at the end of this process is the images are the sounds are the images. They're each metaphors for the other, ending in the final pieces. So I will end with this, which again, Michel Chion's work is, I think, so critical to what we should be thinking about today in working with digital media. I don't really like putting up big quotes, but this one is so rich because this is the fundamental truth. The spontaneous and irresistible weld produced between a particular auditory phenomena and visual phenomenon when they occur at the same time. That's what he calls syncresis. Here's the truth. The joint results independently of any this join results independently of any rational logic. Certain experimental videos, i.e. visual music, is one of them, demonstrate that syncresis can even occur out of thin air with images and sounds that, strictly speaking, have nothing to do with each other. The bottom line, you put an image and a sound together, you're going to make sense of it. You're going to find meaning with it, because we cannot stand not knowing what's going on. It's a survival instinct. So if you take time to engage an object, you will find meaning there. There's one fundamental truth in learning, or in teaching and learning, especially as I've studied how the brain learns. Students are learning whether you're teaching them or not. It's just a question of whether you're controlling what the learning is that's going on. They may be learning that, I go to Old Man Evans' class because I can sleep in the back. They're learning something. It's the same thing here. If we take control of this process, we can have some control over how it unfolds, but the bottom line is this syncresis is going to occur, and that becomes an interesting exercise as we understand that what we're really doing is we're making connections, and our audience, our listeners, are making connections from the domain of whatever this object is to the domain of themselves, and that's just sort of the fundamental process of this activity. Well, thank you. I'm sorry